Hi there, it's Professor Monty, and we're talking about imaginary numbers. Okay, so I is the unique number such that I is the square root of -1. We've talked about in the past we can't take the square roots of negative numbers because they're not real numbers. Well, they're not real numbers, they're imaginary numbers. And imaginary doesn't mean pretend. These come up in a lot of the sciences, especially electronics and electrical engineering. But I is the square root of -1, and I squared is just -1 without the square root. Okay, so let's look at how this applies to make this simple. So if I've got the square root of -16, the negative under there is just going to come out as an I, and then we just take the square root of 16, which is 4. So it's just 4I. We typically put the I after. Now the reason is this is the square root of 16 times the square root of -1. That'd be the square root of -16, and that's where the 4I comes from. Usually we just say, oh, the negative under is the I, so it's 4I. In this one, we have to be careful, because think of this same way. This is the square root of 7 times the square root of -1. The square root of -1 is I. The square root of -7 doesn't simplify. It's just square root of 7. So we can write it this way. If you write it with the I after, make sure the I is clearly not under the square root sign. You may even want to close your square root sign like that to say, oh, the square root ends right there before the I. And to get away from that, a lot of times they'll put the I in front, and they'll just write it as I root 7. Either way is acceptable, as long as the I is not under the square root, because that would mean the square root of the square root of -1. And then they might get a little more complicated. So we've got some stuff going on here. Again, that I under that negative under there's the I. So I know, oh, I'm going to have an I in here. Well, I have to do the square root of 12. The negative out here is just going to stay negative. And then the square root of 12, remember, 2 goes into 12 6 times, 2 goes into 6 3 times, so it's 2 root 3. So it's 2 root 3I, or often they'll write it as -2I root 3. Again, so the I is not under the square root. So you may have some simplification to do. You may have a negative on the outside that keeps your answer negative, but the negative under the square root turns into the I. These negatives don't cancel each other out. This one's still there. That one turned into the I. Okay, so be careful with that, especially ones like this. Students often want to just call that 7I, which obviously it's not. It's I root 7, or the square root of 7 times I. Okay, but it's a fairly simple idea, and we're going to use these quite a bit to do a lot of different things. So try to get used to them and comfortable as soon as possible.